On the daybreak of October 11th, 1854, the auction location on Chalmers Street in Charleston observed an event that would be mentioned quietly in parlors and business places for many years to come. A lady stood on the stage, her hands tied with a silk cord instead of metal shackles, and when the auctioneer lowered his hammer for the last occasion, the final price went above $42,000. In current money, that equals almost $1.3 million for one individual person. For setting the context, the most costly plantation exchange that year, including the main house, 200 acres of prime cotton ground, and 37 bonded laborers, brought $38,000. No public document describes why 17 different males competed against each other with growing desperation. No newspaper dared to publish the particulars of what occurred in that space, and no official writing names the purchaser who eventually gained possession, although 3 observers later confirmed that he departed Charleston on the same day, journeying north with his purchase, and was never seen in South Carolina ever again. The Charleston Mercury records hold a short note of the sale buried on page 9 between shipping notifications and advertisements for patented medicine. 7 words: unusual proceedings at Ryan's establishment. No further comment. The following week, the newspaper's editor resigned without explanation and left the state. The week after that, Ryan's auction house closed permanently, its records sealed by court instruction, its building sold to a shipping trader who transformed it into a storage facility within the month. What made this woman worth more than an active plantation? What mystery did she hold that drove Charleston's elite into a bidding frenzy that was almost insane? What information could warrant a cost so enormous that banks declined to handle the operation through typical means, demanding the buyer carry the payment in physical gold? Before we move on with the account that Charleston tried hard to hide, we need you to be a part of finding these forgotten facts. Sign up for the sealed room and switch on alerts, because stories so purposefully removed from history must be shared. And leave a remark telling us what you believe this woman knew that was worth more than gold. We want to hear your ideas. Now, let us go back to that October daybreak, when something impossible took place on Chalmers Street. Charleston, in 1854, held a distinct spot in the American South. The city saw itself as the highlight of Southern culture. Its stone-paved lanes were lined with stylish town residences painted in gentle, pale shades. Its port was busy with ships carrying cotton to Liverpool and rice to Boston. The Battery Walkway stretched along the shore where affluent families walked in the evening beneath palm trees that rustled in the Atlantic air. Church towers poked the sky from every area, their bells marking time in a city that moved with slow elegance, safe in its wealth and sure of its lasting existence. The populace surpassed 40,000 people, divided almost equally between bonded and free, though authority was completely focused in the control of perhaps 300 families who oversaw the estates, the banks, the shipping firms, and every system of trade that produced money. These families knew one another closely, their wealth linked through marriages, business collaborations, and social duties that went back generations. The Ravenels, the Pringles, the Haywoods, the Middletons, names that appeared on documents, on bank permits, on the boards of every significant group. They ate meals together at the Charleston Club, worshipped at Street Michael's or Street Phillips, and conducted trade in offices along Broad Street, where agreements worth hundreds of thousands of dollars were finalized with handshakes between men who had known each other since youth. But beneath this exterior of refinement and wealth, Charleston kept secrets. Every large fortune rests on foundations that prefer obscurity. And in a city built on the toil of enslaved labor, those foundations held countless hidden wrongs, convenient disappearances, and documents that recorded dealings better left unexamined. Ryan's auction house occupied a 3-story structure on Chalmers Street, just 2 blocks from the market, where enslaved people were purchased and sold like farm animals every Tuesday and Friday. The establishment served a richer clientele than the public market, providing privacy, careful handling, and assurances of excellence that drew plantation owners from as far as Georgia and North Carolina. Marcus Ryan, the owner, had managed sales for 23 years, building a reputation for fairness in a business where honesty was a flexible quality. He maintained perfect records, verified the documents of every person he sold, and kept connections with the banks that funded these deals. His pledge held importance among men who had faith in few people. The morning of October 11th started with standard business. The initial groups consisted of household workers from an estate being settled following the owner's passing, a cook, 2 maids, a driver, and a groundsman. They sold for expected sums to anticipated buyers. Ryan moved through the processes with experienced skill, his voice carrying clearly across the space where about 60 men sat in chairs with vertical slats, fanning themselves against the October heat that still lingered in Charleston even as fall approached. Then at precisely 10:30, according to the pocket timepiece of a cotton agent named Benjamin Whitmore, who later gave a statement, the mood changed. A door at the back of the auction room opened, and 2 men came in, surrounding a woman whose look instantly commanded attention. She stood perhaps 5 feet 6 inches tall, unusually high for that time, with a stance so straight it suggested a military posture. Her skin displayed the dark brown of African heritage, unmarked by the scars that usually gathered on enslaved bodies subjected to field work or physical abuse. She wore an attire of high quality, dark blue cotton with small buttons along the front, clothing much better than what enslaved people commonly owned. Her hair had been styled in a complex design of braids that must have needed hours to finish, suggesting she had access to time and help unavailable to regular plantation laborers. But it was her facial expression that caused the gathered buyers to become quiet. She observed the room with eyes that showed no fear, no shame, no compliance. Instead, her look shifted intentionally from face to face, pausing now and then as though listing and committing to memory every person present. Several men would later mention feeling notably uneasy under that close inspection, as though she was the one judging them rather than the opposite. The 2 men accompanying her wore clothes that identified them as travelers. Dust-covered footwear, coats showing wear from lengthy use, the look of having traveled a significant distance. More importantly, they carried themselves with a tiredness that implied they anticipated difficulty and were ready to react. Both wore handguns openly at their belts, uncommon for an auction location where weapons were typically forbidden. Marcus Ryan came down from his stage, confusion clear on his face despite his many years of professional calmness. He approached the escorts, speaking in hushed tones that those closest to the front could barely make out. One of the men produced a leather folder, removing documents that Ryan studied with growing alarm. His lips moved silently as he read, his face going through surprise, disbelief, and something close to fear. He glanced at the woman, then back at the papers, then at the woman again. She met his look firmly, and for just a moment the edges of her mouth lifted in what could have been a smile, though it disappeared so quickly that observers later disagreed about whether they had actually seen it. Ryan went back to his stage, the papers held tight in his hand. He cleared his throat twice before speaking, and his voice carried an uncertainty that experienced attendees of his auctions had never noticed before. "Gentlemen, we have before us an exceptional grouping. The seller who chooses to stay unnamed, as is their legal entitlement under South Carolina rule, has delivered a woman of about 30 years of age. No identity is given on the sale note, so she will be marked as Lot 47. Her starting point is listed as Charleston, though no former owner is named. She holds no documented background of fieldwork or house service." A voice from the middle of the space called out with doubtful annoyance. "Then what is her worth, Ryan? Why bring her here?" Ryan's jaw tightened, his knuckles turned white where he held the papers. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, forcing everyone to lean ahead to hear. The seller has set a starting offer of $10,000. The quietness that followed was total. Men stopped fanning themselves. The scrape of a pen from a clerk taking notes stopped suddenly. Even the sounds from the street outside seemed to lessen, as though the whole city had paused to take in what had just been said. $10,000 went beyond the yearly earnings of most men in that space. It stood for enough wealth to acquire a substantial estate, a residence in Charleston's most fashionable area, or a vessel capable of overseas trade. For one woman with no recorded abilities or work past, the price was madness. "Have you lost your senses, Ryan?" someone yelled. Others joined in, voices rising in angered confusion. But Marcus Ryan did not decrease the price. Instead, he did something never done before in his 23 years of running auctions. He read from the seller's papers in a voice that became softer with each sentence, making the angry assembly quiet down to listen. The seller gives the following sworn statement notarized before a judge in Charleston on October 6th of this year. The property designated as Lot 47 holds specific knowledge of events and dealings conducted by certain parties between the years 1846 and 1853. This knowledge has been verified through a demonstration before 3 separate observers whose identities remain protected for their safety. The buyer will be given, along with the sale note, detailed guidelines regarding the conditions under which this knowledge may be disclosed. The seller guarantees the truthfulness and entirety of all data and further ensures that this knowledge cannot be extracted through force, as the property has been trained to stay quiet under such situations. Ryan paused, his face pale. The seller ends with the following statement. Any party with interest in events happening at the Magnolia Plantation on June 19, 1849, or with worry for the disposal of certain documents currently believed ruined in the warehouse fire of April 1851, or with participation in the sea event of September 1848, will recognize the worth of securing this lot. The seller takes no accountability for results coming from this knowledge becoming public. The response was quick and strong. Several men stood up suddenly, their faces red. Others leaned back in their chairs, faces carefully blank, but eyes showing planning. 3 men left the auction room immediately, walking quickly toward the door without explaining why. But notably, no one demanded Ryan stop the process. No one suggested the whole affair was a deception or a waste of time, because everyone in that space understood what Ryan had just read. The woman standing silently on the stage held information about specific events, specific wrongs, specific secrets that Charleston's elite had worked for years to conceal. And someone had brought her here to sell that information to the person who would pay the most. Ryan's voice cracked slightly as he spoke again. "The opening offer is $10,000. Do I hear 10,000? For a long moment, no one moved. Then, from the back corner of the room, a hand went up slowly. The man attached to it was middle-aged, his face worn by sun and air, his clothing suggesting estate ownership of moderate success. $10,000, he said, his voice. $12,000. The second offer came instantly from a different corner, spoken by a younger man, whose stylish attire and gold watch chain identified him as Charleston upper class. What followed would be discussed in quiet talks for years afterward, always in private, never where staff or outsiders might listen. The offers rose with speed that defied all financial reason. 15,000, 18,000, 22,000. Men who had come to purchase field workers found themselves competing for something far more precious and far more unsafe than labor. They were offering for safety, for the authority to manage information that could ruin reputations, financially destroy families, or lead to criminal charges. The woman on the stage never moved, never spoke. Her facial expression stayed calm, almost peaceful, as the price linked to her body climbed higher and higher, but her eyes continued their steady watch of the room. And more than one bidder would later state that when her gaze fell on them, they felt she was figuring out exactly how much they could pay, exactly how desperate they were, exactly how much they stood to lose. At $30,000, only 5 bidders remained. At $35,000, 3. The contest had reduced to men whose wealth and authority surpassed that of common estate owners. These were bank managers, shipping company heads, men who controlled not just their own fortunes, but the financial fate of entire businesses. $38,000, said a man sitting near the front, his voice steady despite the massive amount he had just proposed. His name was Cornelius Ashford, and he oversaw 2 of Charleston's biggest banks. $40,000. The reply came from a figure sitting in the dimness at the back of the room, a man whose face remained hard to see despite his closeness to others. The room inhaled sharply as a group. $40,000 was more than the worth of most active plantations with all their land, structures, and bonded workers included. It stood for wealth that few men in the South could claim to hold in readily available money. Cornelius Ashford sat motionless, his face twisted with anger and something that looked remarkably like fear. He turned to stare at the man who had just exceeded his bid, trying to recognize him in the shadows. Finally, he shook his head slowly, stood, and walked toward the exit with stiff dignity. Although everyone present could see his hands shaking, the shaded bidder stood and moved forward into better illumination. He was tall, perhaps 45 years old, with a face that revealed nothing. His clothing was costly but plain, black outer coat and vest, no flashy ornaments, nothing to draw attention. Those who knew him recognized him only as Mr. Whitlock, a name that showed up on no Charleston society lists, no business directories, no church member records. He had arrived in Charleston 6 weeks earlier, rented rooms at the Planters Hotel, and conducted trade with a dozen different parties, always meetings held privately, always dealings that left no public paper trail. $42,000, Whitlock said calmly, as though naming a price for tobacco rather than for an individual person. No one else bid. The quietness lasted for almost a full minute, as Marcus Ryan looked around the room, waiting for any last proposal. None appeared. "Sold," Ryan said finally, his voice barely louder than a breath. "Lot 47 to the gentleman for $42,000. The deal took nearly 2 hours to finish. Whitlock produced a credit document from a Boston bank that needed checking by telegram. A procedure that involved sending a clerk rushing to the telegraph office on Broad Street while everyone waited in tense quiet. Legal papers had to be made ready, witnessed by 2 extra parties brought in from other businesses and stamped with official marks. And finally, Whitlock had to take physical receipt of the payment, which he had organized to be carried from his bank in the form of gold coins that needed 4 men to transport in locked containers. Throughout all of this, the woman stood silently on the stage, observing everything with that same unsettling calmness. When the deal was finally complete, when all papers had been signed and all money counted and confirmed, Whitlock approached her for the first time. He produced a key and untied the silk cord binding her hands. Unlike metal restraints, the rope left no marks on her skin. He handed her a wrap, which she draped over her shoulders with graceful skill. And then he did something that surprised every person still present in the auction house. He offered her his arm, as a refined man would to a lady. She accepted it without delay, her action suggesting she had anticipated exactly this gesture. Together they walked toward the exit, their stance suggesting partnership rather than possession. At the entrance, she paused and turned back to face the assembled gathering. In a voice clear and perfectly spoken, with language that revealed extensive schooling impossible for an enslaved person to have obtained legally, she spoke her only words of the entire proceeding. "Some of you will rest better now. Some of you will rest far worse. And some of you will discover that knowledge once created can never be truly destroyed. It only waits for the right moment to emerge from darkness. Then she walked out beside Whitlock into the Charleston sunlight and disappeared from public record as thoroughly as though she had never existed. The departure of Whitlock and his exceptional purchase set off instant disorder in Charleston's top social circles. Within hours, rumors spread through the trading district like an uncontrolled fire through dry wood. By evening, 3 separate meetings were arranged in private spots, gatherings of men who never met publicly but whose combined wealth controlled nearly half of Charleston's trade. They met behind locked entrances, with trusted staff placed to ensure privacy, and they spoke in hushed, urgent tones about a woman whose very existence threatened to untangle carefully built falsehoods that had protected them for years. The questions increased faster than answers could be invented. Who had sold her? How had she gained the information she supposedly held? What exactly did she know about the Magnolia Plantation incident, the storage facility fire, the sea mishap, and most urgently, who was Whitlock, and what did he plan to do with the information he had just bought for $42,000? Marcus Ryan gave no answers. 2 days after the auction, he shut down his trade permanently, citing health worries. He sold his structure at a large loss to the first buyer who offered cash, packed his belongings, and left Charleston on a vessel headed for New Orleans. Before departing, he burned every record of sales conducted in his establishment over the previous 8 years, creating a large fire in his open yard that required the fire department to prevent it from reaching nearby buildings. When questioned by authorities about ruining business records required by rule to be kept, Ryan responded only that some dealings were better forgotten by everyone involved. The Charleston Mercury never released a follow-up to its unclear, 7-word reference to the auction. The editor, who had resigned the week after that brief notice, moved to Atlanta, where he worked in obscure positions at several different newspapers before passing away in 1863, having never written another piece about Charleston trade or society. But while official Charleston remained quiet, private Charleston was full of guesswork and fear. The coffee shops on Broad Street, where traders gathered to discuss business, became centers of worried conversation. Men who had been friends for decades began avoiding one another, unsure who might be involved in whatever scandals the mysterious woman knew about. Social invitations were declined without explanation. Partnerships ended suddenly, and several prominent families abruptly announced plans to spend the winter in Europe. Unusual for estate owners who normally stayed in South Carolina to oversee the gathering season. The first serious inquiry into the woman's identity began 3 weeks after the auction, started by a lawyer named Harrison Calhoun. Calhoun specialized in property rules and had built his practice defending the interests of Charleston's wealthiest families. He was known for his careful handling, his thoroughness, and his readiness to work in legally unclear areas when clients required such adaptability. On November 1, 1854, he was hired by a group of 7 clients who declined to name themselves publicly, but who provided him with substantial money to uncover everything possible about Lot 47. Calhoun began with the notarized statement Marcus Ryan had read during the auction. He visited the court requesting to check the original document supposedly witnessed by a Charleston judge. On October 6th, the clerk informed him that no such document existed in the public records. When Calhoun pressed for an explanation, pointing out that Ryan had clearly read from verified papers, the clerk became defensive and suggested that perhaps the document had been filed incorrectly or had been taken out for court review. But when Calhoun requested to speak with the judge whose official mark had supposedly appeared on the papers, he found that Charleston employed 3 judges authorized to notarize such documents, and all 3 denied any knowledge of the transaction. This should have been impossible. Notarized documents required official stamps, observers, and entries in record books made specifically to prevent imitation. Yet somehow, papers bearing what seemed to be real verification had appeared for the auction, then disappeared completely from official archives. Calhoun next tried to track the seller. South Carolina law demanded that anyone entrusting property for auction provide proof of ownership and legitimate transfer documents. These papers should have been filed with Ryan's business records and later moved to the court when Ryan shut down his establishment. But the fire Ryan had created ruined everything. Calhoun spoke with Ryan's former assistants, finding out that the two men who had escorted the woman to the auction had arrived at Ryan's office 6 days before the sale, carrying documents that Ryan checked in private. The assistants recalled that Ryan had come out of that meeting looking upset, had poured himself a large amount of hard liquor despite the early hour, and had instantly sent a messenger to his attorney. That attorney, a man named Silas Peaton, refused to speak with Calhoun or anyone else about the matter, citing client privilege. When Calhoun suggested that Ryan's sudden departure and destruction of records might be suspicious activity worth looking into, Peaton responded calmly that his client had broken no rules, that all dealings had been carried out lawfully, and that if certain parties found the auction's result uncomfortable, perhaps they should examine their own behavior rather than questioning legitimate business procedures. The investigation reached its first major finding in late November, when Calhoun located one of the two men who had escorted the woman to the auction. His name was Thomas Burke, and he worked as a private messenger specializing in sensitive deliveries and difficult tasks. For a large fee, Burke agreed to speak with Calhoun in a drinking place near the docks, far from Charleston's fashionable areas where they might be recognized. Burke was cautious, choosing his words carefully, but he provided information that began to clarify the situation. He had been hired in August, he explained, by a party who contacted him through a go-between and offered exceptional payment for a single task. He was to travel to a specific spot in the South Carolina Low Country, pick up a package, and transport it securely to Charleston for delivery to Marcus Ryan. The spot was an estate house that had been deserted for several years, standing empty except for a caretaker who visited occasionally to prevent total ruin. When Burke arrived at this location with his partner, another messenger named James Ridley, they found the woman waiting for them. She stood on the front porch of the abandoned house, dressed in the same dark blue cotton dress she would later wear to the auction, with a single leather bag containing her items. She handed Burke a sealed communication addressed to Marcus Ryan and told him that she was the package they had been hired to transport. Burke confessed to being confused and troubled by the situation. He asked the woman who she was, where she had come from, and why she needed transport to Charleston. She replied with a calmness that Burke found deeply unsettling. "I am goods with exceptional value," she said. "You have been paid to deliver me intact and unharmed. Beyond that, you need know nothing except that your employer will ensure you face no legal consequences for this transport." Burke and Ridley finished their assignment, delivering her to Ryan as instructed. They received their final payment from an anonymous origin through a hidden drop arrangement that kept them from ever identifying who had hired them. Burke never saw the woman again after leaving Ryan's auction house, and he insisted he had no knowledge of what happened to her after Whitlock claimed possession. But Burke provided one extra detail that Calhoun found important. During the 3-day trip from the deserted estate to Charleston, the woman spoke very little, but on the final evening, as they camped beside the path, she had looked at Burke with an expression he described as almost pitying. "You are wondering who I am and what I know," she said, "so I will tell you this much. I am someone who listened when powerful men believed no one was listening. I am someone who remembered when powerful men believed their secrets would be forgotten. And I am someone who discovered that knowledge becomes valuable only when those who hold power fear its revelation. You will not be harmed by your part in this affair, Mr. B., but others will lose everything they have constructed on falsehoods." Remember this when you hear their names mentioned in the months to come. Calhoun reported these findings to his anonymous clients, and their reaction was quick and firm. They demanded he step up his inquiry, find the woman's real identity, locate Whitlock, and figure out what information had actually been purchased for $42,000. They provided more funds and made it clear that no cost should be spared. But Calhoun's enlarged investigation brought frustration rather than solutions. Whitlock had left Charleston the same day as the auction, traveling north by private horse-drawn vehicle. Questions sent to Boston, where his credit document came from, returned information that the bank holding his account was a small private institution that served wealthy customers who valued privacy above all else. The bank's officials refused to give any information about Whitlock beyond confirming that his credit document had been genuine and that funds were available to cover the $42,000 transaction. The deserted estate where Burke had retrieved the woman proved equally puzzling. Property documents showed it had belonged to a family named Ashton, successful rice growers who had left the property in 1850 after the head of the family passed away without direct inheritors. The estate had been stuck in legal disagreements for several years, with distant relatives fighting the will and courts trying to resolve opposing claims. During this time, the estate house stood empty, and no one could explain how the woman came to be there or who had organized for her presence at that location, specifically for Burke to pick up. Calhoun interviewed the caretaker who periodically visited the Ashton property. The man, an elderly free man named Isaiah, who had worked for the Ashton family for decades, admitted he had seen the woman approximately 6 weeks before Burke arrived to collect her. She had simply appeared one morning, walking up the long entrance path to the house as though she had every right to be there. Isaiah had questioned her, explaining the property was closed and she had no business there. She had smiled at him and said she was waiting for someone and would cause no trouble. Isaiah, worried by her presence, but unsure what authority he had to force her departure, had allowed her to stay. She stayed in one of the upstairs rooms, kept herself neat, and ate from supplies Isaiah brought occasionally, and spent her days sitting on the front porch, reading from a thick, leather-covered book she carried with her. Isaiah never learned what the book held, but he noticed she turned its pages slowly, as though committing the contents to memory. She had an educated manner about her, Isaiah told Calhoun, spoke proper English, better than most white folks I know. And she had this way of looking at you like she could see right through whatever you were showing her and into what you really were underneath. Made me uncomfortable, if I'm being honest, but she never caused any trouble. Never asked for anything beyond basic needs. Just sat there day after day reading that book and waiting. When Burke arrived to collect her, she had given the book to Isaiah, telling him to destroy it after she left. Isaiah admitted he had disobeyed this instruction. Instead, he had hidden the book in the estate house, curious about what contents might be so important that they needed destruction. But when he later retrieved the book and tried to read it, he found it was written in a language he could not recognize, symbols and characters that looked like no alphabet he had ever seen. Calhoun convinced Isaiah to show him this book. They journeyed together to the deserted Ashton estate, and Isaiah led him to a hidden spot beneath a loose piece of flooring in what had once been the library. The book was there, wrapped carefully in oil to protect it from wetness. Calhoun examined it with growing confusion and wonder. The volume was perhaps 300 pages, bound by hand, its cover bearing no name or recognition. The pages held dense writing in what seemed to be some form of secret writing or code. Symbols arranged in regular layouts that suggested language but revealed no clear meaning. Mixed throughout the text were numbers, dates, names of places, and occasionally English words or phrases that appeared without context. Calhoun recognized several names, prominent Charleston families, specific estates, vessel names, but they appeared embedded in the coded text in ways that gave no clear meaning. On the final page, written in plain English, was a single sentence that made Calhoun's blood turn cold. This record contains testimony of events witnessed between 1846 and 1853, recorded in cipher, to protect the witness until such time as revelation becomes profitable or necessary. The key to this cipher has been transferred to one party who purchased knowledge with gold. All others will find these pages contain only mysteries that cannot be solved. Calhoun understood instantly what he was seeing. This was the original document, the record from which the woman's valuable knowledge came. She had somehow witnessed events, talks, dealings that Charleston's elite desperately wanted to keep secret. She had recorded everything in code to protect herself, then sold the key to that code to Whitlock for $42,000. And this book, now worthless without the cipher key, represented a fortune in information that would remain forever sealed unless Whitlock chose to reveal it. The implications were astounding. This meant the woman had not merely stumbled upon dangerous information, she had systematically recorded it, guarded it, and waited years for the perfect moment to change that knowledge into value. This demanded patience, intellect, planning, and a readiness to endure continued enslavement while knowing she held information that could set her free. Who was capable of such self-control? What kind of mind could maintain such concentration across years of waiting? Calhoun reported his findings to his clients, and their reaction confirmed his suspicions about the seriousness of the situation. They demanded he hand over the cipher book immediately, which he did, and they informed him that his assistance was no longer needed. They paid him generously for his work, provided a substantial bonus for his careful handling, and made it clear that he was to stop all investigation and never speak of the matter again. Harrison Calhoun accepted these conditions, but before surrendering the book, he had copied several pages, including the final English sentence, thinking these copies might prove helpful should circumstances change. He locked these copies in his office safe, where they would remain for nearly 4 decades before anyone discovered them. Meanwhile, throughout December of 1854 and into January of the new year, Charleston experienced what could only be described as a quiet wave of panic among its elite. Men who had built fortunes on cotton, rice, and enslaved labor found themselves looking over their shoulders, wondering which secrets might come out, which past wrongs might be uncovered. Several prominent figures suddenly announced retirements, selling their businesses and properties at unfavorable prices in apparent rush to turn assets into cash and leave South Carolina. Others grew suspicious, expecting surveillance, hiring private guards, conducting their trade with new levels of secrecy that bordered on the ridiculous. And then the exposures began. The first came in February 1855, when a shipping business based in Charleston declared financial failure after its main investor pulled out all funding without explanation. The company's collapse seemed normal until investigators checking the firm's records for creditors discovered systematic deception dating back to 1848. The company had been reporting cargo amounts to investors that were significantly larger than what was actually transported, pocketing the difference through false shipping documents and bribed customs workers. The sea event of September 1848 mentioned in the auction statement apparently referred to a shipment that had supposedly been lost in a storm but had actually been sold through illegal methods, with company officials claiming insurance payments for cargo that had never been lost. The scandal ruined 3 family fortunes and led to criminal accusations against 7 men. During the investigation, one of those charged committed self-harm, leaving a note that mentioned only, "She knew. She was there. We believed her invisible, and that belief has destroyed us." The second exposure emerged in April when a fire at a Charleston storage facility revealed proof of a previous fire in April 1851 that had been intentionally set to destroy account books documenting unlawful slave trading. South Carolina, like all American states after 1808, banned the import of enslaved people from Africa, but substantial money could be made by bringing Africans illegally into Charleston and selling them to estate owners who asked no questions about where they came from. A secret plan involving customs workers, vessel captains, and wealthy buyers had operated for years, using that storage facility to temporarily house illegal shipments before distribution inland. When investigators grew, the book remained in the hands after Calhoun's anonymous clients seized it from him. They tried for years to decode it, hiring language experts and code breakers, offering rewards for anyone who could unlock its contents. All attempts failed. Without the key that Eliza had sold to Whitlock, the book stayed impenetrable, a mocking reminder of information they could see but never read, knowledge that existed just beyond their grasp. In 1872, the book disappeared from the private collection where it had been kept safe. No record explained how it vanished or who took it. But 15 years later, in 1887, parts of its contents began appearing in scholarly writings focused on pre-Civil War Charleston finances. The articles written by various history experts using archival research documented business methods, financial schemes, and social arrangements that had defined Charleston's elite before the conflict. The information was presented academically with careful source references and calm language, but those familiar with Charleston's hidden history recognized, sentenced to 5 years in confinement. He passed away in 1858 while still imprisoned, having lost his wealth, his good name, and eventually his life as a result of misjudging the woman he had attempted to sell. The discovery of these messages prompted renewed academic interest in Eliza's story, and in 1947, a historian named Catherine Morgan published what would become the definitive life story, The Witness. Eliza Rothman and the Architecture of Resistance. Morgan's book combined decades of study, spoken accounts, archival finds, and careful assessment to build a complete picture of Eliza's life, her methods, and her influence. Morgan argued that Eliza represented something more significant than an isolated case of remarkable intelligence and opposition. She represented a pattern of hidden action that marked enslaved people's relationship to power throughout the South. Eliza had not held supernatural skills or special circumstances that made her resistance possible. Rather, she had noticed chances that existed. Others saw it as an assault on their forefathers and their city's legacy. The museum received threats, and safety measures had to be increased to safeguard the exhibits. But attendance was substantial, and the display traveled to several other cities, introducing Eliza's story to crowds who had never encountered it before. The 21st century brought fresh attention to Eliza's story as digital tools made historical study more reachable, and as social media platforms created spaces for discussing hidden histories and forgotten stories. Several documentary filmmakers tried to tell her story, though none of these ventures moved past initial planning stages, hampered by lack of visual materials and the difficulty of presenting a story that covered decades and involved dozens of connected crimes and exposures. In 2015, a scriptwriter named Angela Morrison wrote a one-woman stage show based on Eliza's life. The play, titled The Cipher, opened at a small theater in Philadelphia and received strong reviews for Morrison's performance and for the way the script dealt with questions of memory, fairness, and the long-term outcomes of systematic oppression. The play traveled nationwide for 2 years, performing in theaters, universities, and community centers, introducing Eliza's story to audiences who typically had limited exposure to detailed narratives about enslaved people's methods of resistance. But perhaps the most significant recent event in Eliza's story came in 2019, when researchers using advanced imaging technology examined the coded book that had been preserved in university archives. The technology allowed them to find layers of text that had been removed and written over, showing that Eliza had not merely documented wrongs and financial plots. She had also maintained a personal narrative, a life record of sorts, writing down her own thoughts, worries, and hopes, alongside the factual documentation of what she... Education. One passage dated March of 1851 captured the emotional load of her documentation project. I have carried this knowledge for 5 years now, adding to it almost daily as I witness new crimes, new cruelties, new demonstrations of how power corrupts even men who consider themselves moral. The weight becomes crushing at times. I know things that could destroy families, end businesses, send men to prison or to the gallows. And I can do nothing with this knowledge except preserve it and wait. Wait for what? I do not always know. I tell myself I am waiting for the right opportunity, for circumstances that will allow me to secure my freedom in exchange for what I know. But some nights I wonder if I am simply afraid. Afraid that releasing this information will achieve nothing. That these men are too powerful to face real consequences. That my years of observation and documentation will prove meaningless, or worse, afraid that my death will come before I find a way to use what I know, and all of this careful work will vanish with me, leaving no trace that I witnessed these things, that I remembered, that I refused to let their crimes disappear into the silence that they depend upon. Another passage written shortly before she arranged her own sale revealed the careful thinking behind her plan. I have realized something important. The information I possess has value precisely because these men know they are guilty, know their crimes could destroy them if exposed, and therefore live in perpetual fear of discovery. This fear makes them vulnerable in ways their power otherwise prevents. They will pay enormous sums to secure silence or to control information they believe threatens them. So, I fear most. I will become the most expensive property any of them has ever acquired, not because of my labor or my body, but because of my mind. The thing they have insisted does not exist within me. Let them finally acknowledge what they have always known and always denied. Let them pay the price for that acknowledgement, and let that price free me to become more than their property, more than their fear, more than their crime. The discovery and publication of these passages generated renewed interest in Eliza's story, with several scholarly articles examining the psychological and philosophical dimensions of her experience. Here was a woman who had not only opposed slavery, but had thought deeply about the nature of power, knowledge, and resistance, who had developed complex strategies based on her understanding of how fear and guilt create weaknesses in those who possess power. The passages also revealed something that previous historical accounts had not fully captured. Note: the original text ends abruptly after this point in the source file.